name is Charlie Roseland. I'm the president here at Advantage Asset Management. So we're a property management company for anybody that's not aware already. Focused mostly on kind of North Houston, Woodlands, Conroe area. Do have some properties down around the closer to the city center as well, but mostly concentrated in North Houston. Do have a couple commercial properties, a couple apartments as well that we manage, some pretty small ones. So 99% residential focus, just a couple small commercial properties at this point. Today I wanted to thank you everybody for joining on the phone or here in person. Definitely appreciate you guys coming out. We've got David Shine here, Dr. David Shine, who is our broker for the firm, and he's been in the real estate, business real estate broker in the state of Texas for over 35 years now. What's the total? Is
40 next week.
Oh, okay, 40 next week. So definitely wealth of experience, especially here in the Houston area. So definitely happy to have him present a topic that I think is very relevant for people that are looking at investment properties on their own, or real estate agents that could be also interested in talking to investors about basically what does it mean to be a landlord. So especially for first-time homeowners or first-time investment property owners, so what are some things to look out for? Both everything related to how does it affect your taxes, how does it affect property values, what do you need to look for, what makes good rental properties, a lot of details like that Dr. Shine will go through. And then he'll also at the end here go through a little bit of a local real estate outlook, some of the information, kind of the economics that he's actively reading on a weekly, daily basis. And did want to do a little bit of a promotion for him as well. He's recently had a book come out called The Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures and Common Sense Solutions to Help Fix America. So pretty political driven book, clearly, but the high-level summary is that this thought-provoking, nonpartisan book reviews the last 100 years of American presidents from Wilson through Obama. Not just criticism, but common sense solutions to help fix America before it's too late. So that just became available on Amazon a little over a month ago for anybody that might be interested. But with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Shine.
And before we get started, we might want to we've got two new arrivals here and give them a chance to get settled. So we have lunch for you here.
Thank you.
Stuff. Give enough handouts?
Yeah, I'll go for now. Did you guys want to get in lunch?
Okay. All right. Well, we don't want anybody to say they went away hungry. Charlie, I appreciate the invitation to speak today and also appreciate the kind introduction. And sometimes people hear a lot of my credentials and they're like, how did all this stuff end up? But when I was in graduate school, I worked my way through graduate school doing several jobs, but one of the jobs I did was selling real estate. So in early 1978, I qualified to take the Texas real estate broker's exam and actually took it the week before I took the Texas State Bar exam. And just coincidentally, the first week of 1978, almost exactly 40 years ago, I received both my broker's license and my Texas bar card in the same week. So I've maintained my license, both bar card, and I actually also am licensed for both law and real estate in the state of Virginia, which is kind of my adopted home state. So but that's how I ended up in that situation, and I've been working with Advantage Asset Management for about 4 years now, and then I agreed to be the broker for the company about 2.5 years ago. So I'm trying to help them out on both the legal front and the real estate front. And it's been very interesting to work with the company, the growth here. The company predominantly managed single-family homes in its early beginnings prior to the current ownership. And then recently we've added an apartment complex, a second apartment complex. And then kind of interesting, we have a condo that sometimes you develop a condo and it doesn't sell and it gets converted into rental. So they have a condo development that they're also working with. So kind of interesting path that we followed. And geographically, most of the properties are in the Woodlands, Conroe, and related areas. But for me, it's interesting because I'm in the Heights. I teach at the University of St. Thomas, which is in the Museum District. So, and I've worked all over Houston and have been a pretty good student of the Texas real estate market. So we're going to talk today. We try and do these presentations, by the way, about every other month. And so sometimes we get a little challenged as to what we're going to talk about. The last presentation I did was on the new tax law and the impact on the real estate market, how are investors impacted. The short version is investors make out pretty well because they're not touched by the new tax law. So the new tax law, if anything, helps real estate investors. So that's, kind of a green light. Frankly, it's not particularly good for people who are buying high-end houses because of limitations on interest and taxes. So it's pretty interesting how things have come together. So in any event, Charlie and I discussed topics about 2 months in advance, 6 weeks in advance. So I said, well, how about we talk about why would you want to be a landlord and how does it work? And I speak from experience. I've been a landlord, not just a real estate broker, but I've also been an individual landlord for many years. I've had some very interesting experiences. I've actually evicted tenants from my own apartments. I had just this year, I'm renting out my former residence in Virginia. It's a beautiful custom home. I rented it to a very nice family, a little later in life family, second marriage for both. They've been together about 4 years. They moved in last May. And in late January, the husband contacted me to say that he had been put out of the house by the police. And again, this is not anybody you would ever envision being hauled into a police car, just so you know. And he said he had been ordered to stay away from the house, and it might impact payment of the rent. So over the last 3.5 months, I've been coordinating the departure of that family and have been successful at getting a new tenant in there. We've done as Advantage Asset Management done here. We went through the property while we had it temporarily vacant, had it a significant part of the inside painted. We did all the honey-do list that most people have on a home and things like that. So if you think I'm just talking from an academic standpoint, I can assure you I've been in the trenches, and it's been pretty interesting. The worst experience I think I ever had is I had a fourplex in downtown Richmond, Virginia, in a beautiful area called the Fan, which was one of the original developments, kind of like the Heights would be to Houston. And I inherited a few tenants, and I didn't evict the tenants when I took over the property. We gradually changed out tenants. And the last tenant I kind of invited to leave. We discovered that his utilities, which I did not pay, he paid them directly, had been turned off about 3 months before we asked him to leave. And we found candle drippings around the apartment. So they didn't have any electricity, so they were literally using candles. So we were very fortunate the property didn't burn down. Yeah. And as you might expect, we did a massive renovation of that unit after those people moved out. Not just heavy surface, we put a new kitchen in it. We redid the bathroom. We did some very substantial changes, actually moved the entry door to the property and stuff like that. So like I said, been down the trail in a lot of different experiences, personally, not just in terms of getting calls from the fine people here at AAM and talking with them. So anyway, first thing is, if you're going to rent property, keep in mind that the rental properties are a separate market from true residential. And like I said, my fourplex was perfect. They're very simple units. Renting my custom house in Virginia is a little bit different experience. And I had a beautiful hot tub there. Ultimately decided to remove the hot tub before I rented the property because of the liability and maintenance issues involved in it. So it's a little fancier property. So keep in mind is whatever's in there, is oftentimes the landlord's responsibility, but the tenants aren't always as careful with things as owners are, and you end up getting lots of calls. So I've adopted some lease policies that I'll mention to you in a minute, but like my house has a whirlpool tub. Like I said, we took the hot tub, which was outside, out, and stuff like that, but it is still taking care of business. So sometimes looking at simpler properties is going to be an easier rental situation. You may not rent for as much, but you may have long-term less maintenance on the property. And the other thing is parallel to that is the exterior of the property, especially if you're renting single-family homes, is getting people to take care of the outside of the house is also a bit of a challenge. I've kind of specialized over the years in developing a not a minimalist approach to landscaping, but a low-maintenance approach to landscaping, planting perennial plants, bushes that don't need a lot of care. Today, in different markets, we look at drought-resistant plants. In Virginia, where my home is, up in Virginia that we're renting, we look for deer-resistant plants because the deers are not being hunted and they have overrun a lot of suburban neighborhoods and will eat just about anything. And so the nurseries up there actually have signs on them that say, deer-resistant plant. Doesn't mean deer won't eat it, they just will eat it last. So if they've eaten everything else in your yard, they will still eat those, but they'll eat them last. So maybe you'll have a fighting chance of having a few plants left at the end of the winter season. So one of the things is also, again, as I've personally run into this, is make sure that you understand what the homeowners association will allow you to do. Something that happened to me where I'm renting in Virginia is that subsequent to my renting the house out, the homeowner association decided that there were too many houses being rented and arbitrarily had a big vote and said that they were going to limit the number of houses that could be rented. Now, if that ever rolls back on me, speaking from my attorney side, we'll be suing the homeowners association, but it'd be nicer if we didn't. So good idea, before you get in, once you've found the property, it's really good to ask, make sure if it is in an HOA, and most of our suburban properties are in homeowners associations, is to ask for a copy of the restrictions, get some information about those restrictions before you make a final commitment. And in most of us, the way we do contracts today, we put in an option period, and one of the things you'll want to do during that option period is to get a look at the homeowner restrictions. Some of them can be very interesting, like I've seen a set of restrictions that prohibit any type of home business, which is usually not an unusual restriction, but if you've got people who are doing some type of home business, which is very common, people start in their home and then they move to a rental property or, to an office or something, could be an issue. One of the things we run into some neighborhoods is having the trucks of people that do like air conditioning and plumbing. A lot of times they're allowed to take those big trucks home, which have the billboard painting on the side of them, and some homeowner associations will not permit that. And that has an impact from the standpoint if you're renting to a family, and frankly, AC is a great business in Houston. Many people, tenants and non-tenants, are in that business. You confront them parking the truck in the driveway, and it's like, no, it has to be behind the property line, and there's similar restrictions for boats and RVs. So understanding what the restrictions are doesn't mean you won't buy the property, but it means when you're renting the property, you want to make people aware of what the restrictions are. I'm a big fan of inspection reports, despite the fact that I've had many disappointments with inspection companies, and I've had things that I've bought and sold enough properties personally that we've looked at inspection reports and then we've come across problems later and said, gee, it sure seems it would have been nice if we'd known about that one. But in any event, we still do recommend them as a good first step. If you can, walking through the property with the inspector is probably more effective. to really get a little bit of feedback that might not show up in the written report. Unfortunately, the written reports, and I sound like a lawyer at the moment, are written for the protection of the inspector, where they say, well, there's all sorts of disclaimers in there, this is just our best guess, and we didn't open the walls, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to make sure that people are aware of the fact that the inspection report is a limited investigation, but and they're, for instance, not responsible for looking at the homeowners, the HOA restrictions and stuff like that. Strictly look at the property. Also, termite inspection in Houston, Texas, and the surrounding area is an absolute must. Termites are a severe problem here, and we don't just have subterranean termites, which is the ones that are treated. Your foundation's treated for that, but we also have airborne termites, and airborne termites are virtually, you don't treat a property for it, you treat a property after you're diagnosed for that, and that, of course, is the multicolored tent that you see around town. And if you see a multicolored tent in a neighborhood, I will predict that within 5 years, every house in that subdivision will be treated. It's not complicated. The bugs don't just disappear. They get gassed in one house, a few critters that get loose go next door and all that. So we're experiencing that in the Heights right now. So they've been doing it for about 5-6 years, and there's not a super lot you can do about it, although if you're rebuilding or building new, you can put in treated wood. And one of the things I just did, just came out of a heavy reconstruction in the Heights, is I required my contractors to work to install all treated materials inside the house, which is not an obvious thing. It adds a very small percentage to the total cost of the job, but it is about the only way you can head off airborne termites because you're using a treated product. Obviously, everything that's outside your house and everything under your house should be treated, and that's pretty standard, but, kind of a good idea to watch out for things. In terms of buying investment property, condos tend to be a popular investment, especially first-time investors. And the issue with condos is the condo association may not permit rental. I'm familiar with the condo association in the museum district, is that you cannot rent for different terms and stuff like that. They define what's going on, almost like a New York City co-op. So certainly be aware of that. Keep in mind that financing for rental property is different. It's expected that you'll put down at least 20%, usually 30%. Now, we've all heard all these TV commercials about come to this flipping big meeting, and we're going to tell you how to flip houses and all that. Well, that's all fine and good, but for most of us buying good properties that are going to rent quickly and that are in attractive neighborhoods, you're going to have conventional financing, and that financing is going to run in that ballpark. Also, keep in mind, if you're planning to change your principal residence, you want to buy your principal residence first and then buy the rental property, because each property that you add to your portfolio, if you're holding it individually, will be on your credit report. And the mortgage companies, again, I've been a landlord a long time, so I have multiple rental properties, is they look at all of your rental properties, and they look at all the income and the lease terms and stuff like that. So it's a good business. There's some great tax advantages to it, but you need to be aware of the financial impact, and I think sometimes people are not quite up to speed on that. And so it's a good idea to work. The best thing to do is work with mortgage brokers who are experienced at helping people buy rental properties, because our traditional mortgage brokers are used to selling people first and second mortgages on their main residence or second home. They have trouble doing the arithmetic. I mean, we're not talking about anything sophisticated here, folks, but they have trouble doing the arithmetic of, this guy's got 6 mortgages, but he's got 6 rental income streams, and the properties have been consistently rented. One of the things they do that's disturbing to me is they use a factor of about 90%. So if your my properties, I'm a very effective landlord. My properties have very close to 0 vacancy. In fact, technically where this family blew up on me in Virginia, because of the way I've handled it, it'll be a zero vacancy. The new family will be in before the current family stops paying rent. So I actually have a zero vacancy, even under a kind of a quasi-disaster. But the situation is that sometimes the mortgage companies don't know how to do that arithmetic, and they use a vacancy factor that's designed to protect the mortgage company, but it may also make it more difficult for you to buy property. So just so you're aware of how that happens. One of the things, I don't want to get into legal technicalities, but two of the more popular ways of holding rental property today are LLCs. Limited partnerships used to be the standard for buying a building for your business or buying a fourplex or an apartment building. LPs have been fading because LLCs are so easy to set up, and from a legal standpoint, there's not a big difference between having an LLC and an LP, but people are getting really used to LLCs. Now, you can also set them up through a corporation. Usually you'd be using a sub-S. LLCs and sub-S have also been treated fairly well under the new tax law. So maybe a further incentive to do that. The basic pros and cons, again, we're not going to do a legal lecture here, but let me just say that the basic pros and cons are the idea of the LLC or the sub-S is to create a legal barrier between you and your property. Most people who are landlords should never need that protection. But if there is a terrible incident, if the property burns down and there are people inside and fire department people and other people are injured and all that, certainly you're going to have insurance. You're going to have very good insurance. But if you have something that exceeds the normal good insurance, then having that additional layer of protection of the property in a legal framework may be an advantage. The flip side to that is unless you are a very senior landlord and have substantial assets, most likely the financing is still going to rely on your personal credit. So you're not going to be able to set up an LLC and say, well, here's my pristine LLC, loan the LLC money. And they're going to say, yeah, sure, as soon as you sign here as the guarantor for your own LLC. But that doesn't have to be endless. And again, with good interest rates, the interest rates are rising a little bit, but they're still nowhere near killer interest rates. And so there might be some things to work with. What I recommend in the outline, and I'll just say it as well, is certainly part of your team of buying property, in addition, a real estate professional, is to have a tax expert review your situation, review the best way to structure your investment portfolio. Also, I think I mentioned it later in the outline, but I'll mention it here, is if you are acting as a landlord or a very successful business person, and many successful business people decide to become landlords, so it kind of ties in, is having an umbrella policy is certainly a highly recommended approach. And to give you, for instance, because I have an umbrella policy, I carry fairly high limits on my automobiles and my houses, but they're not horrible. But, like instead of, I have like 100, 300 or something like that on my cars, where some people will carry minimums or a little bit lower than that. The umbrella policy requires you to carry a certain higher level on your regular insurance. Umbrella policies themselves are not terribly expensive because their idea is most things for most of us in life are going to be covered by your basic insurance. So, and they make sure of that by making sure you pump those limits up a little bit. But you could probably get a $1 million umbrella added to your homeowner's policy for $200, $250 a year. Now, I have enough property that I'm in a commercial umbrella, and it's about $650 a year for $2 million of coverage. Again, that is just backup coverage. That's if something really bad happens that we don't even want to talk about here today. But to keep in mind that while being in the rental business, it's a good idea that you are increasing your exposure, and having, a good insurance package is certainly an important aspect to being in the business. One of the things is that in looking at properties is sometimes people see a property and think, boy, I'd really like to have a home in the Texas Hill Country. That's great. But keep in mind that depending on where your property is, it may be a hot rental market. It may not be a hot rental market. So make sure that wherever you do purchase property, that you understand the rental market, exactly where the properties are. And I have seen many people buy properties in Galveston, and they bought in the wrong end of Galveston, or they bought in other places. They never go to the property. They were planning to do intermittent rental, which is a different. Our address today is primarily talking about regular long-term rental, where you're putting people in for 1 year or 2 year leases. If you're looking at vacation rental, especially if you're looking at renting it using it part of the time yourself, keep in mind there are special tax rules that if you use it too much, you will lose part of the deduction of the expenses on the property. So, however, a kind of a cottage market that's come up in the last 5 years is the Airbnb market, and there's several services, and I don't want to just pump Airbnb, but I've used them both as a landlord and as a traveler, and it's a very effective service. It's starting to get more expensive. Their fees are going up. They are now required, I think in the city of Houston, they're now going to charge an occupancy tax like if you were staying at a hotel. So that may reduce the popularity of some of these intermittent rental services. But again, you're going to run into HOA issues, condo issues, depending on what you're renting. And so you want to certainly be careful about that. But I just want to mention that is a very different rental market, A to Z, than doing regular long-term rentals, which most of us who are doing that are looking at initially a tax shelter rental properties usually lose money in the early going, a long-term period of good income growth, and then selling the property for capital gains. So, and that has nothing to do with flipping houses. Flipping houses are houses in inventory, and they do not qualify for capital gains. So it's kind of interesting on that. I already mentioned about the taxes and about the LLC, but the long-term capital gains are still out there and available. So again, with regard to that, buying and holding rental property is still a very solid investment. Now, something that happened again in the new tax law that you may not have heard about is the 1031 tax-free exchange, and I've done those in the past. So I've sold rental property in one location and then moved to another location and bought another rental property. It used to be that you could do different things. The new rules say pretty much that you are only able to do this with real estate, which works great for real estate investment. And so if you have a residential property, say you're moving here from Denver, Colorado, you have a rental property in Denver, it's appreciated nicely, you're ready to get into the Houston market, you can sell that property and then buy a replacement property here and defer the capital gains. Now, having said that, I strongly recommend that you work with a tax consultant on that, because the rules for the 1031 are very strict. And I'm not going to go into them right now, but they're strict rules. It's not an easy deal to do. I know because I've done one that worked and I've done one that busted. Busted meant I didn't get the replacement property identified and under contract under the limitations of the 1031 exchange rules. So keep in mind, it's out there. It was not taken away. It was limited, but it doesn't limit it with regard to regular real estate. But you still need to comply with the rules in order to have the advantage of doing it. And obviously, for most of us, most of your tax advisors are going to say what you want to do is you want to move your income as far forward in your life as possible, so that, when you do sell out some rental property, you sell it out when you're retired and your regular current income is less. So that's, the general strategy. And again, investment real estate is a great way to do that, especially if you have good properties that cover themselves. And most of mine do most of the time. With regard to the actual rental business, and this is where companies like Advantage Asset Management come into play, is you need to really check out your tenants. Like I said, I've got enough stories. And again, the tenants that I just told you the horror story about a few minutes ago, the police hauling the husband away, we could never anticipate that. There's absolutely nothing in the paperwork on these people that would suggest this situation. And like I said, we're still working to last the details out, but I came out pretty much 100%. So, but I did some hustling to get that done. But it's if you are a busy executive, having the expertise, knowing who the contractors are to come work on your property, knowing what needs to be done, doing the move-in inspection, doing the move-out inspection. There's a lot of details involved in it, but you're doing it yourself. Certainly you want to have a tenant evaluation form. I get quite a bit of information from my tenants before I consider them, and a lot depends on what the risk factor is. Like I have a property that I'm renting primarily to college students. It's next to UTMB Galveston, so we're renting to medical students, nursing students, and all that. And I'm sorry, but those are A tenants. Could we have a bad tenant? Sure, but part of the tie-in here is you've got a location that feeds a specific demographic, and that demographic works great for where the property is located. So you need to think through those issues when you're out shopping for property to say, who's going to rent this property and what works? And one of the things that people look at if you're renting property that's friendly to families is it in a good school district? Just the same kind of stuff that people consider as buyers, people look at as renters also. So it's something important. One of the things that I'll get tempted to do, especially if we've had a property vacant for a while, is to extend credit. That's what you're doing when you're a landlord. You're putting someone in on credit, basically, that they're going to pay the next 12 payments or the next 24 payments. Is you want to make sure if it is somebody who's got a credit issue, that you take a really hard look at the issue and see if it's something that you can buy into. Recently divorced people a lot of times can be very good tenants. They're rebuilding their credit, but they may also have been the person who was the spendthrift and triggered the divorce. So, it's just a real tough call. I personally have rented a lot to young tenants who do not have a track record, and I rely on their previous landlord. But I've had situations where people literally moved into my fourplex from home and were coming for graduate school. One of the things that I've done with very young tenants, first of all, I don't rent to people who are below graduate school if I can. I primarily don't rent to undergraduates, and I'm in student markets sometimes as a professor. That works for me. But you want to sure take a look at the situation, and don't be shy about getting a guarantee from someone who has no credit or damaged credit. And what I usually do is do the first year. So I try and find multi-year tenants, even if they're on a one-year lease, that people that logically will probably rent for another 2 or 3 years. Doesn't always work, but the less friction, the less turnover you have in your property, the better. So you have people coming in, and when we did a presentation last fall, one of the things we talked about is so many thousands of units were damaged in Hurricane Harvey, it produced a bonanza of short-term tenants. And as much as there's a lot of really good people who get flooded out, it's not a reflection of the individuals. It's a reflection of they're planning to move back to their house if they were a homeowner, and then they're going to be a tenant. And sometimes having them as tenants is not a blessing because you're going to end up doing a cleanup and doing a transition. And pretty much my rule is every time a tenant moves out, no matter what happens, you take a hit. I mean, you're going to pay you may pay a new rental fee if you have your properties listed for rent. You may find that there are cleanup things that the previous tenant would have tolerated, But the new tenant comes in and says, oh, well, there's scratches on that wall. Oh, well, this is this way. And so each time it's an opportunity for you to spend more money on your property. And so it's something else to consider. Again, we're pretty much past the worst of the Harvey situation. And I must say, sadly, many of my friends are not back 100% in their houses. I have 4 friends personally who got flooded out. And most of them, if they were 2-story houses, they lived on the 2nd floor, and because they had pets. Kind of interesting thing. I'm going to touch base on that in a second. But taking pets is something I've gotten pretty hardcore on. I will tell you that, because it's a tough deal. And many people renting single-family houses, especially, or apartments on the farther out edges of town, are doing that because they have pets. And they're specifically looking, so it requires a little bit more diligence and a little bit more preparation. But I want to talk, this is the second page of my outline, talk about a little bit about the leasing process. Again, if you're working with a good rental management agency, they're going to be using good forms. AAM is a member of the Board of Realtors, so we use the Board of Realtor forms. These are very comprehensive forms. You can also have a custom lease. As an attorney myself, I write my own leases because I like them. And they're customized to my properties, but you may not want to spend that kind of money every time you do a lease. But my rules are pretty tough. I really don't put anybody in my properties if they're not going to be there at least a year. Depends on the nature of the properties and stuff. We have some more transitional properties. We'll do 6 months. We generally don't do anything less than 6 months. It's again, the friction causes issues for you as a landlord. It's a lot of handling, and life's short, folks. So you want to, you don't want to be dealing with it. Pets or not, I am not personally a pet person, so maybe I'm a little less sympathetic than other people, but I know that some of the apartment complexes will have a limit, like no dogs more than 25 or 30 pounds or whatever, but it is a tough situation. Male cats tend to mark their territory. It may not be visible in the house. We allowed somebody with cats recently at the Galveston property in our garage apartment out there, not in the main house, but in the garage apartment, and the cat had marked the whole thing, and it took my son's down there managing that property for me, and he said, Dad, he said, you just can't believe it. He said the odor, they had to really go way out to get it settled down. But again, you may have properties that are not easy to rent unless you accept pets, and all I can say is you want to have a heck of an inspection on the way in, and you want to have even better inspection on the way out, so you're not paying for somebody else's pet damage. And again, it's not an easy deal. And one of the things that I've implemented here at AAM, and you might want to think about, is traditionally people had 30-day notice in leases. That does not work. So all of my leases and all of our leases here now have 60-day notice. And here's how that works. You do the property from April 1 to April 30 to rent it for June 1. That gives them, most of the other landlords in town have got at least 30 days. That gives them the chance to give notice in the month of May so they actually can move into your property on June 1. So watch out for that, because many people cannot move without giving notice, and then you've got a great tenant, and you've cleared them and all that. And they say, yeah, we know you're available May 1, but we're not available till June 1 because we have to get out of our current lease. Part of that's good. You know that they're at least, cooperating with their current landlord. But the bad part is you're now sitting there saying, well, do I suck up a whole month of vacancy because this person can't move quickly enough? So doing 60 versus 30, I found, again, I have virtually zero vacancy rate. I think that 60-day notice helps that a lot. And I'm also very quick. When I get a lease application, we generally clear them in 24 hours. So we get right on top of it, and we make the people put a deposit down on the property to hold it, even if it's 60 days out. So we don't just hold it for grins. In other words, they sign the lease, but they also put the security deposit down, and that way they have, as the cliche goes, they have some skin in the game. Many of our leases contain auto renewal provisions, say they renew for a 1-year period unless either party gives that 60 days notice. That helps to give people some incentive to get with you and say, hey, I'm moving to a bigger apartment, I'm going to another house. It kind of keeps people in the game so they're not just lollygagging around. The alternative, which is done more in commercial leases, is the holdover issue, where if they don't sign a new lease and they don't move out, the rent usually is 50% more than it was. So if the rent's $1,500 a month, the rent's $2,250 a month if they're still there and the lease has expired. And that, again, gives people a little bit of incentive to work with you. We have some special issues, although I will tell you we had the same issues in Virginia as we do in Houston. Mold is a big deal in bathrooms and other parts of houses. I've dealt with it in commercial properties, and we've dealt with it in residential properties. Mold is regarded as a health issue, although I think that is largely overblown, speaking as a professional in the industry. But the reality is you want to rent a property that is mold-free, but then you want to make sure when people move out that the property is mold-free. And again, I've rented to a lot of graduate students, and we ran into an issue where the bathrooms hadn't been washed for a whole year. So they had mold in the bathrooms, not because of anything we did as a landlord, but because they are college students and they just didn't clean the bathrooms. So we put in a couple different things. One of the things is we don't clean anything ourselves. I may own the properties individually, but I work 7 days a week. I don't need to be cleaning out somebody else's dirt. We hire commercial cleaning services, and what we tell the tenants is, you can clean it and you can call a commercial cleaning service. They'll coupon you through Living Social or Groupon, and you'll pay $150. If I call a cleaning service and say, I'm a landlord and I need you to go in and do a move-out cleanup, they're going to charge me $300 or $350, and that's a no coupon deal. So we really do press people to say, you're responsible for the property. What I've done with my properties is to tell people that if they think there's some mold in the property, they have 3 days from the day they move in to tell me that they think there's some mold in the property. Otherwise, we say we deem them responsible for it. So we do put the pressure on the tenant to make sure they're moving. Also have a similar provision in my leases on drains. A lot of tenants move out and you find out that half the drains in the house don't work or work real slow, and that may be part of the reason they're moving out. So my leases now say, again, if in the first few days you find a drain that's draining slow, you let me know. I'll get a person in there. We'll get that drain fixed. But when you move out, we expect every drain to work. And if you have a problem with the drains while you're in there, we are going to charge that to you. We're not paying a plumber to come clean out your grease trap or hair trap in your bathroom. So sometimes good management like this really can save you a lot of money down the road. The next issue is smoking. I'm a long-time anti-smoker. To be just very blunt, I don't mean to offend anybody here as a smoker, but smoking is a very small minority of the population today. It has dropped dramatically, and it continues to drop. Thank goodness, because it's the most controllable health issue. As landlords, smoking does a lot of damage. We talked about cats marking their property. About the only other thing worse than that is people smoking in your property. As you know, virtually every major hotel in the United States has gone completely non-smoking. They have big signs up that say, if you smoke in this hotel room, we're going to charge you. The rental cars have signs in them today that say, if you smoke in this rental car, we're going to charge you $200. So my leases all say no smoking on the property at all, and you are responsible for your visitors as well as for yourself. And if somebody moves out and you've got smoke odor in it, again, I'd hire a professional cleaning service, and whatever it costs, I'd send them the bill. I talked about good property insurance. One of the things that happened up here in the Woodlands is a number of the houses that flooded up here did not have flood insurance because they weren't in the 100-year floodplain. So unfortunately, if you're buying property, even in areas that traditionally have not flooded, which includes Houston Heights, the Woodlands, several other areas that have not flooded in the past flooded in Harvey, which is by now considered a 500-year incident. If it flooded, then you need to, really check for mold and termites, by the way, because they're more susceptible now because of whatever damage happened, even if it was a minimal thing, maybe got some water in the garage. But you also want to make sure that you look into having flood insurance. Flood insurance is federally subsidized in most markets, and it's if you need it, it's a good investment. And again, we've got such severe problems in Houston with underinvestment in flood control and overbuilding with massive blocks of concrete that my projection is that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. I think flooding is going to get worse, not better, because they're not making the giant steps that would need to happen to put in a really effective flood plan for the whole area, not just City of Houston, which is useless in that regard. One of the things I want to mention, because we've run into this, is if you are a landlord, you have a responsibility that continues beyond your death. So if you're planning to rent your properties and leave them to your family, make sure there's a plan in place. And again, if you have professional management, that certainly makes life a little bit easier. But especially if you're self-managing, make sure that you have an estate plan that includes keeping the rent's going, that somebody knows where the rents are being paid to and stuff like that. Don't depend that something will happen there. So be careful about that. So do keep in mind that your estate plan may change if you do get into the rental business seriously. Or again, your tenant, your tenant, your client who you are selling rental properties to may also want to be careful about what they're doing, and it doesn't hurt to say, hey, you just bought a new house or you just added your first couple rental properties. Have you updated your estate plan to make sure that somebody's going to be taking care of the show if you become disabled or pass away? Remember, with such a long-living population today, we have a much higher chance of being disabled than we do of actually dying. And so people need to make appropriate estate plans in that regard also. I wanted to talk a little bit about the downside. I've already touched on several issues based on my own experience. Again, none of them came out terribly. I mean, we made money on the properties that we handled, even the one where the guy was burning candles. He didn't burn the place down. That was a good thing. We got him out of there without having to go to court to evict him. That was a good thing. And we needed to renovate the property anyway, and it came out beautifully. I mean, we took, literally took a sow's ear and turned it into a silk purse, and it rented very easily for the years I owned that property afterward. So it's not always the bad thing, but one of the things that I wanted to mention is the rental business is its own business. It's a serious business, and just as if you're operating any other business, you need to have cash in the bank, you need to have lines of credit, you need to have vendors that you work with on a regular basis. This is kind of the same thing, and so you need to have the financial wherewithal to stand a property if there was a problem with it. And I'll give you again, and I don't mean to overemphasize my own experience, but I'm a very long-time landlord, is my main property sustained a major fire in July of 2016. We moved in last weekend. So 2 months shy of 2 years. We had one garage apartment was not damaged in the fire. We got rent on that apartment, a reduced rent, until October 1, and then we've had zero rental income from October 1 till May 1. And we do have tenants lined up to go move in May 1. But the point of the exercise is I didn't miss a single mortgage payment. I didn't miss the interest payment. I didn't miss taxes or insurance. But you have to have your financial plan in place so that if something bad happens to one of your properties, hopefully not more than one, but if you've got several properties in the neighborhood and the neighborhood floods, you see how you might have a situation where you need to cover a little bit more. It doesn't mean you have to have it all in cash. If you've got lines of credit that you haven't tapped, even credit cards that have big limits on them that you're not using. It doesn't all have to be, oh my God, I've got to have, $50,000 in cash in my pocket. It doesn't work that way. But having rental property should be part of a good, comprehensive financial plan. And don't be shy as real estate professionals to say to people, look, we're glad to help you buy this property, and it looks like it's going to be a great rental property, but talk to your estate planners and talk to your tax people and make sure that they're working with other qualified professionals that help them get their life in order so that this becomes a positive part of their experience and they come back to you and buy more properties. Because what we find is that a lot of our clients here are multiple owners, 4 and 5 house owners or more. And so if you get into this business and you do the right things over time, it can be a very good business. One of the things is that repairs are expensive. The accountants call it a sinking fund, I believe, is to make sure you understand that, every 10 years an air conditioner will need to be replaced, sometimes less. We just replaced a 8-year-old unit in Galveston, 8 years, and the building has multiple units. The unit we didn't replace is almost 20 years old. So when I heard that a unit was blown, I was kind of hoping it was the older unit, and it wasn't. It was the newer unit. But the older unit is a commercial unit. The newer unit is the usual trash that people will sell you if you don't specify the brand names. So if you're going to be a landlord and a successful landlord, you can get familiar with what's good and what's not good out there. And I'm a huge fan of doing it right the first time. So, but it's a pricey deal. So again, having some financial backing, having some wherewithal to handle problems are pretty key part of it. I've mentioned several times about tenant damage and about tenant move out. The reality is you're probably not going to be able to collect everything from the tenant, either because you don't want to go sue the tenant. Texas is the worst state that I'm aware of to collect from deadbeats, the worst state in the United States. The joke about this is that Texas, of course, was not part of the union in its early going, and they would write on bills in the rest of the United States, GTT, gone to Texas, because if the people moved here to escape their debts, they would not have, they couldn't collect them down here. So the rumor is that the reason Davy Crockett, who had been a congressman in his home state, had moved to Texas was to escape his creditors, by the way. So we have a very famous historical example. Of course, you saw that turned out for him, but at the Alamo. But it is important to understand that you will almost always absorb some of that yourselves. And in terms of if you've got a really bad experience, about the best you can do working with some of the landlord reference services is to provide them a bad reference, so that if people are checking these people out, they will make it harder for them to get a property in the future. Also, if you have a very substantial problem, you can file a small claims court lawsuit against them. They will probably no-show. You'll take a default judgment. The judgment can be perfected, meaning it can be filed over at the courthouse and becomes a permanent record in that county. If people check lien records, that doesn't turn into garnishment, but that debt will show up as against their credit. And so it can make it difficult for them to get credit in the future. And so there are things you can do, but again, we're usually not going to worry about that unless something very extreme happens. So if you're looking at an $800 or $1,000 that the security deposit didn't cover, most of us landlords are writing that off. Again, it's part of your expenses of doing business, but, don't look, even if you've got great legal help and great real estate agents and stuff and managers, it's just the nature of the beast. That's, again, why you want to reduce turnover by having long-term tenants in there, because it tends to be part of the friction of what's happening. Eviction is not easy. If you have somebody in there who's not paying the rent, Each location, each city, each state has its own eviction rules, and I refer that even myself as a licensed attorney. I don't do evictions. I refer to attorneys in the area who do a lot of evictions because they're more reasonably priced and they know what the rules are. But it is absolutely no fun to do an eviction, so I go to great lengths to avoid doing an eviction. Occasionally they're necessary, but it's kind of a specialized deal. And one of the things that I just talked about, reporting tenants that leave the property in bad condition or don't pay all the rent, stuff like that, you need to be careful because you can also be sued for defamation. Now, again, your umbrella policy should protect you from that if that happens, but you probably have a deductible and it's no fun to get sued. So if you do make statements about a prior tenant, be prepared to back it up, where you've sent letters to the tenant saying, hey, we didn't get April's rent, we didn't get May's rent, and you're out of here in June. And then you tell a new landlord that, and then they come up with one of these bogus lawsuits claiming that, that you defamed them, and it's like, hey, here's the records. Where's those checks for paying April and May's rent? Well, they're not there. So there's a cliche. Truth is a complete defense. So you want to make sure that you're real careful. The other thing that I've been put in an unfortunate position, if they're still in your property and you are desperate to get them out, you need to be careful not to give them a false positive reference so that they will move, because the next landlord may come back and say, you lied to me, you defrauded me because you told me this guy was current on his rent and he wasn't, and we found out after he went south on our rent, and they're looking for somebody to fuss at. I don't know that that's a cognizable legal action, but I can tell you it won't be your best day and all that. So I was going to just talk very quickly about the current real estate market. The real estate market in Houston generally is good. It is better than it's been. 2015, the market had a significant dip due to the oil price drop. Oil prices are up in the 60s, $66, $68 a barrel last time I looked, last couple of days. So one of the things is that as long as oil stays up in that area, the whole area does reasonably well. One of the ironies, I track employment very closely, is that in 2015, total employment in the greater Houston area went up despite losing 100,000 jobs in the oil industry. I mean, there's almost stunning statistics, and the bad part about that is that the oil company jobs tend to be good pay, good benefits, very stable jobs. They were replaced by retail, hotels, and a good sector, medical. So the medical part's good. Some of the other sectors that showed growth that actually kept the greater Houston market slightly up, even in a really bad market, were lower income people. Now, in terms of landlords, that may push you towards buying for rental, or in terms of selling as a real estate agent, selling lower priced properties that more people can afford. That's straightforward. The housing market is definitely having some challenges. The cutoff is $500,000. Most of us are not going to buy $500,000 and up rental houses. We're going to buy those for our own residence. Rental properties a lot of times are half that, or roughly half that or less. So, but the $500,000 and up market, we're definitely seeing some counter offers and some playing there. I think there'll be a slight recovery in that market this year, but the new tax law is definitely going to have an impact on that $500,000 up market for residences. But that may cause a few people not to buy a house, but may produce very well-qualified tenants who say, well, if I'm not getting a really good tax advantage out of buying this house, heck, I'll just rent and let you, the landlord, take care of the maintenance and take care of stuff for me, and I'll go out and party a little bit more and stuff like that. So we don't know exactly what's happening in the millennial generation. We do know that millennials are very much inclined to stay as tenants, which is good for the rental market, and that they may change as they get a little bit older, but the current outlook is they may be the first generation that are really not committed to owning a home, whereas the American dream for well over 100 years has been, you get out of school, you get a job, you buy a house. And so there's a, it's still not clear that that's not going to happen, but they seem to be, some of you heard, I think the term is boomerang or yo-yo children that go to school, come back and live with dad, mom, and stuff like that. Definitely a little bit more of that going on out there. And maybe the parents will get tired, throw some of them out of the house, and they'll become good tenants for you. But we're still sorting through it. So those are my prepared remarks, and I know we're close on time, but I'm glad to answer some questions.
I'd like to know, excuse me, how we can protect each other, because when somebody submits an application, we run the credit, we run the criminal background, and I go a step further and I call the last landlord that they had and say, hey, listen, how is this person paying? If I get kind of an iffy comment from them, I ask for a letter stating that they paid their rent on time. But I know that people still slip through the cracks. So how can our owners, as responsible owners, protect the next person from somebody who's a bad tenant without doing the defamation, going the defamation route?
Well, again, anything that's true is true, and there are various credit checking services that specialize for landlords, and you can report truthful information. You can say, Billy Bob moved out. At the time he moved out, he owed 2 months' rent. There were dog droppings all over the backyard. There was cat urine odor in 2 rooms of the house, and his security deposit didn't cover the lost rent, much less the cleanup that we had to do on the house. And you would have receipts. That landlord will have receipts from paying, some people, landscape people, clean up the backyard. Other people come in and repaint the house with odor treatment and then painting and things like that. Like I said, I've been through all of this at some point, so I know I've got the receipts to show it. But that's probably the single best method. And if a new landlord does call you, usually you can kind of talk in code. You can kind of say, well, yeah, Billy Bob's ready to move, and but you have to be careful. If they say, well, did he pay all the rent in time? You can't say yes, because they didn't pay all the rent in time, and you're just magnifying the problem. And Billy Bob has to pack up and go find the landlord who doesn't check references, or go live at home with mom and dad again. So be it. But and again, it's tempting to give a false reference to get them out of the house, but I would be real careful about that, and because it doesn't help us clean up the rental market, because there are people who are serial bad tenants, and they get away with it by going around. You're nodding your head, so you've been there. And I've had a serial bad tenant. The guy told a great story. We decided to take a risk on him, extend credit to him, and we eventually didn't lose any money. He actually paid all of his rent, but he ended up moving out of our place, one of my apartments, into his sister's house or something like that. So he was definitely not on board. And the other thing is to check employment, because usually people at good risk as tenants have a solid employment record, and that's one of the things that I look at. So 2 things I look at most closely are the most immediate landlord and their employment reference, and make sure they actually work where they say they're working, and that they actually make the amount of money. Now, a little trick on that is a lot of stuff's being done electronically today. I'm finding a lot of apartment complexes and landlords will not give references without a hard copy. So when I send out a tenant application, I say, you must sign this and you must return it to me, because I need to be able to fax, still out there, folks, fax or email that to the representative to get that reference from that previous landlord. So it's a little cumbersome, but the good old-fashioned signature is still out there.
Any thoughts on security or comfort animals? And now I think they're moving into piglets too, not just dogs.
Yeah. My gut reaction, and I have been in many places where we've had the so-called comfort animals, is that it's nonsense. You know, I grew up in a generation with the famous German Shepherd seeing eye dog, and I fully respect that. There are people who have significant physical disabilities, who have specially expensive, specially trained animals that are helping them. We don't ever want to be in a situation where we're discriminating against those people. And in fact, if you have enough units, you're going to be covered by discrimination laws, so you need to really be careful. But in terms of comfort animals and stuff like that, I'm unimpressed. I can tell you the trend line today is it's gotten so bad that people are starting to require medical evidence. And I saw something recently, and I can't recall exactly, but in the last 2 weeks, there was a medical doctor, somebody who came out publicly and said that this is really getting ridiculous, and that one way to control it is to say, where's the medical evidence? That if somebody just doesn't put a little scarf around a dog that says comfort animal, and you're expected to do that.
I know there is some kind of a certificate. Is that the medical evidence that's required?
Well, yeah, you want something from a medical doctor, but this is certainly going to be a continuing issue. But that doesn't mean, in terms of accommodation, I don't know that that's been completely sorted out yet in terms of whether you're required to accommodate an animal of any kind, whether it's legitimate or not.
It seems like it has.
Yeah.
That you are required. They can't disqualify you because of the animal, even if it's a no pet place. That's what I've been told that the law says, and you can't ask for a deposit, a pet deposit, or any types of changes in rent.
Yeah. I would take a hard look at that no pet deposit. So where did you hear that you couldn't ask for a pet deposit?
Through I had a client like that. Yeah. And I started talking to my broker about it. Yeah. And they said that they had heard about it, and that they also understand that you can't require a deposit. And I actually put the lady in the house. The other agent knew about it, and he understood. And he said, we'll just collect a deposit on the other dog. But he said, send me the certificate and a picture of the dog, and we did. And this girl's only in her 20s and has some kind of a heart problem, so she needs a comfort animal.
Yeah. Well, again, I would certainly get some paperwork on it, but I am not aware of any situation that would require you to waive a pet deposit. Just, so you might want to check. If you run into that again, I know you've got that deal's already baked, right? But I would check that out, because those are not related events. If you let an animal into the property, whether it's a so-called comfort animal or a seeing eye dog, which are very highly regulated animals, by the way. The seeing eye dogs, they have to be like 2 years old of extensive training. They only work for like the next 5 years, and then they get retired. In fact, there's a whole business of people taking them retired.
This one's like that too. She says it's almost to its retirement age, and she's already had to put in for another dog to start being trained.
Precisely.
She has to swap them out.
Right. And the positive side to that, if it's a legitimate trained animal, the likelihood of accidents in the house and stuff is extremely low, because they're using a particular age range of animal where they're used to only going out a couple times a day. But there's a lot of animals that do not follow the rules, but they're well-trained well-qualified, certified dogs. But if people are just running a scam, it's going to get a lot messier. But again, I'm not aware of any restriction on the pet deposit. One of the things I didn't mention that I did want to mention is I'm a huge fan of getting rid of carpet. And I have very limited carpet in some of my properties. One of the things I do when I buy a property and renovate it is I take all the carpet out. And there's new tile products that are very popular that look like wood. Many of my friends who've had their first floor of their houses flooded are going to replace their wood first floor with tile that looks like wood. Tile's not foolproof. It can be broken. It can be cracked. but tile, wood, and wood veneers are really becoming popular, and they are much easier to maintain. And as against pet situations, when I decided to do that, I've had multiple rental properties. I had a rental property where the tenants killed the carpet in 1 year. I know it was a decent builder-grade carpet. It wasn't super high-end, but it was carpet that I expected to last 4 to 5 years, and it looked bad in 1 year. And they had dogs, and so, like I said, there's a reason I'm not pushing the dog thing. Yeah, but carpet can show some wear. The other thing is, in terms of renting, having no carpet is if people have allergies or asthma. My house in Virginia is carpet free, and again it rented really quickly to the new tenant. I actually put in there that there's no carpet in the house, that it's all tile and wood, and I think that helped. A medical doctor's renting it, by the way, so I think it helped because they appreciate the fact that it's really, really hard to clean carpet successfully, to really get any type of allergens and stuff out. So, and that could be a legitimate reason not to rent property to people even with service animals if you're renting apartments on a hypoallergenic basis. Related to that, and this is not something we did in our Heights restoration because frankly we were so far behind we couldn't spend the time looking, is another thing that's popular today is low VOC paint, low volatile organic compounds. So if you're hiring a painter, you may designate low VOC paint, and then when you're renting the property, you can actually say this property's been freshly painted, but we use low VOC paint. I think that's going to become more common in the future. Seems like, again, with the continuing involvement of people using, service animals and people having all sorts of medical excuses and stuff, that I can see that coming where people are going to say, we really want a place that has as little allergy exposure as possible. And I think if you do accommodate people in those situations, you're liable to have longer-term tenants.
Well, and maybe less liability, too.
Right.
If you had somebody that had an accident and was temporarily on a cane or something,
right,
and went from a carpet to a wood floor or a tile, they might fall down or trip or something.
Precisely. Rodney, you have
actually. If you have an LLC that's holding the rental properties, you mentioned umbrella policies, would you have the one umbrella policy personal, or would you put it in the LLC? How would you? The
way I'm structured, I have one umbrella, and it lists the different entities.
Both are insurable interests.
Yeah, but I want to point out I'm working with a commercial real estate agent. The agents that do the regular home insurance.
Or just personal.
Yeah, State Farm, Allstate people. Those are all good companies and good agents, but if you get to like 4 rental properties, you move into commercial, and you're better off working with an independent agent, and they can write a policy that lists all of your things, whereas a purely residential agent may not be able to insure more than your house in your name. So it makes a difference how the policies are written.
Yep. And then the second question is, it sounds like you've had good fortune, so you may not have all of the practical experience, but from your legal experience, how long do you have to wait before evicting a tenant, and then how long typically does that take in Texas?
I can answer.
Go ahead, Charlie. We've been doing them because when they do them up here in the Woodlands, they use an attorney designated up here. I stay out of it.
You can start the eviction process essentially after you give a 3-day notice for whatever the reason happens.
So let's say they have
non-payment.
So they have till the 15th, according to the contract. They have till the 15th. If they don't pay by the 15th, you have 3 days.
You give them a 3-day notice on the 15th. Then on the 18th, then you can file the eviction paperwork. Now with the paperwork, so like David was saying here, we don't do that ourselves. We outsource that as well because we want to make sure it's done in accordance with the local regulations and whatnot. But we hand it over to this company that is a professional eviction company, and with their lawyers that are specialized in this. The process itself at that point, it typically takes about usually about 2 weeks to get a court date set. And then that court date is usually another 2 to 3 weeks out. So really by the time, and then at the court date, it usually is another week until the writ is done, when the actual constable comes out, knocks on the door, if they're not out by that point already, and says, we're forcibly evicting you. So that whole process from the time that you do your 3-day notice till they're actually out takes about a month. It can be shorter if it's an extreme circumstance. You can kind of request that. Then again, that usually requires more money as well. But it's about a month process. And with that, again, you want to make sure, as David talked about a lot earlier, that you've got the paperwork in hand. So here's the evidence of non-payment. Here is our 3-day notice. Then that 3-day notice has to be both mailed, physically mailed, and posted on the door. So there's a lot of these steps that have to take place to make sure it's done in accordance. If there's anything off on the lease, then it's going to get kicked back, and it sets the whole thing back. Or if there's anything that you didn't have paperwork-wise, basically you start that process over as soon as that's identified.
So it's time-consuming, and I will say I've had rental property in Richmond, Virginia, and it's 60 to 90 days to do an eviction in Richmond, Virginia.
Wow.
So
if you did have
longer.
another tenant waiting and you had their deposit, you could have some damages associated with having to find them a place to stay in the meantime.
Right, precisely. Well, we usually have a clause in the lease that talks about first making the property available and not warranting that, because you can never, even great tenants may say, the moving truck didn't show up, I'm sorry. We usually let 1 or 2 day deals. We let people work that out between the tenants, because I'm usually end to end. I literally have a new tenant in there as the old tenant's moving out. Sometimes I actually bought a guy out for a week. Like I said, he was going to move out April 30th, and I said, can I give you a week's rent back when I give you your security deposit back? He left the place in nice condition, and I said, because I actually want to get my painting crew in there and spiff up the place, and I had so tightly rented it, we didn't have a break. It is difficult. You can do little touch-up stuff and do plumbing repairs and stuff, but in terms of completely repainting an apartment, the landlord really needs to own the property at that point. So we usually do that right at the beginning when we take over a property, but I've bought occupied property, so the first vacancy period. So we ended up in the fourplex, going through each apartment as they became vacant the first time, and did the cleanup and renovations. But I took a building that was renting 4 apartments, $500 a month each, and when I sold it 7 or 8 years later, they were renting for a little under $1,000 a month each. But like I said, I made $40,000-$50,000 in investment in that time period. But the property sold at a profit, and it was kicking. So, but that's what it takes. It takes that type of management. People who are not patient cannot buy properties like that. They need to buy something that's ready to move in, maybe do a little touch-up painting. So it depends on where you are. We did dramatic renovation in one of the units that I mentioned, the one with the candles in it, but we also did significant renovations in the other 3 units.
I will say that, come back to the eviction side, that Texas is a very landlord-friendly state, at least. So even though the rules are different, in each of the different counties, slightly different, it is generally landlord-favorable. So as long as you do have the correct paperwork, you follow the correct process, we have not lost an eviction that we filed. Fortunately, we're not filing a lot of evictions, but like we talked about, sometimes you just can't predict that a tenant's going to be a bad tenant, and we have had to go that process, but we've never lost an eviction.
So on the evictions, is this strictly a financial thing? In other words, do you evict people for other than non-payment of rent?
Eviction is the non-payment is definitely the number one reason, but we have had some folks that have basically broken the rules of the lease, so having too many people over or living in the house. Yeah, exactly. Just frequent complaints of noise and illegal activities, potentially, things like that. So
there's a concern. I have a condo, but you have an HOA, right? And so part of the requirement is to abide by the rules of the HOA.
And that's in the lease. That's in the lease.
But if they do that, well then, is that grounds that you can pursue an eviction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's considered breaking.
And I think we had the case recently with the work trucks, the panel work trucks being parked in areas that were not approved by the HOA. So, but the lease says that a well-written lease says that the tenant has to comply with the rules of the HOA. So, I mean, you do it on the front end, and then you have a basis to do it. And again, the problem is then you're still creating friction. You're still creating a turnover because that person says, well, I'm not going to comply with the rules. And you're like, well, you have to, you're violating the lease. So you put the person out. What we usually try to do in those cases is give them notice that they're being terminated, but immediately place the property up for rental so that we can, again, try and avoid the vacancy gap. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
So the other question that came to mind, and part of your question triggers it, right? We have one unit. Mm-hmm. So, we're not commercial. So, you get into these issues of discrimination. If you have less than 10 employees, certain rules can't be enforced on you, right? So accommodation, for example, if somebody comes and wants to rent and they're in a wheelchair, we have no interest in having to redesign the facilities to accommodate.
They can redesign it and pay for it themselves.
They're not under obligation.
And then they have to put it back before move out.
But if you only have one unit, are you required to do that accommodation? In other words, because you're under a threshold.
Well, there's two answers to the question. One of them is the standard for discrimination is 4 units. Okay. So but I'm also a licensed broker. Mm-hmm. So for my own properties, I have no exemption because I'm a licensed broker. Okay. So if you have that issue and you're a one-shot landlord, unfortunately, you may be better off running it yourself because we, as professionals in the industry,
because you become professional at that point.
At 4 units yourself, but there are very few. We really run into very few issues, and one of my areas of expertise is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which not only covers employment, but it also includes facilities access. So like this building, this condo development, office condo development, has to be completely compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act because of when it was built. I have a 2-story house in the Heights. We're not required to have an elevator because it's not a 3-story building, and it's because of its classification. We voluntarily put in a handicap ramp and we put in a handicap bathroom, but we didn't have to do that, but we did it because it's good business for the property. So a lot depends. You go through each individual issue. I worked a case for a restaurant where a guy in a wheelchair tried to get into the men's room stalls and he couldn't. And we reached a settlement. I was the expert. I wasn't the attorney. I was actually the expert on the case. I went in there, and you could get into the men's room. This building, by the way, this restaurant has now been replaced with an apartment complex. Big surprise in downtown Houston. But you could get in there, but then you couldn't go left, right to get into the stall. All they had to do is move the door on the first stall from this side to this side, then it was lined up with the door. I mean, some of the stuff is not that complicated, but, somebody has to think about it. But usually one-shot landlords are not an issue, but again, a lot of our people are renting multiple units anyway, and we get so few requests for accommodation. Like I said, we haven't run into much with the service animal deal, but I haven't found, I've been doing this, like I said, 40 years, and not all of that have I had different issues running, but I really haven't run into very many issues. And as you just said, if the building needs to be renovated to accommodate a specific accessibility, unless it's a commercial building and it's required to be accessible, that's a different story. But if these freestanding houses, then they need a handicap ramp, they need to put it in, and they need to take it out. And a lot of times, if the property is not already accessible, the individual is not willing to make the investment in a property that they're renting. So it's usually they'll go look for properties that have already been converted, because usually if people put in a handicap ramp and stuff like that, as a landlord, I would probably leave it unless it was really obnoxious and see what the next tenant wants. So sometimes it makes the properties more accessible anyway. So they leave the improvement, in other words.
I don't think I would want them to do it on their own either.
Yeah.
You don't know who they're going to hire or anything.
Well, you always, as the owner, you always control that. One of the ways a lot of developments do is they say we approve the landlords. You know, we approve any contractors you hire go through the landlord and the rental management company. And one of the advantages using rental management company is we use the same contractors over and over again. So we know that they're going to clean up after themselves. We know they're going to do good code level work. On plumbing and electrical, one thing I didn't mention that's very important is safety. A lot of municipalities today are requiring key change out on a tenant change out. A lot of small landlords are used to just passing the keys from one tenant to the next. Many municipalities actually put in laws that people aren't really aware of that require key change out. What I do with multiple properties is I've got sets of locks that are all compatible, but they're all the same brand, but they're not the same. And we flag them so we know we can go in and change that front door lock out, put a different front door lock that I already own, and then, a couple of years down the road, we may circle another door lock in there. But it is a pretty good gap and coverage. So there's several things that you can do like that. But if peepholes are required, you want to make sure that they're in the doors.
I was going to ask you about that. What about the back door?
I would make sure you follow code. I don't usually worry about back doors, but I would follow code. A lot of back doors in our suburban houses have glass in them already, but the issues having
there's some kind of code where the door that goes into the garage. In other words, it says that both front door and back door need to have access to see outside. So some of these rental companies, no offense, it's just that some rental companies are putting peepholes in the back door that goes out to the garage. And that doesn't make sense to me.
Doesn't seem like it would provide much help. One of my concerns beyond the peepholes, which I don't find particularly helpful, by the way, is fire control. Obviously, we're recovering from a major fire. Nobody was there when the fire happened, so we didn't have any risk of loss of life. But we have burglar alarm system. Burglar alarm system did not detect fire until the building's almost collapsing. So in our rebuild, we have remote fire monitoring in there. And we have, but for code, a lot of code is electric fire alarms, depending on the age of the property. So I can tell you that we're, especially given what I've been through, I've got fire extinguishers in my properties and all, and I've gone to the next level. But the first step is to know what the municipality, and it's usually local rules that cover landlords. And so you want to make sure that you're complying with whatever your local rules are, whether that's peepholes, usually burglar alarms are not required, but fire alarms are, smoke alarms. One of the things I'm doing on my rental properties is with the smoke alarms, we've gotten rid of the annual batteries. We're using the 10-year units. But we've had issues where I had a 10-year unit that failed in 2 years. In fairness to the manufacturer, they sent me a new unit. It was easy. They sent it to me, and they said, put the new one, the old one in the box because we'd like to see it. And, they gave us a return mailer and stuff. But there's a lot of little people. That's what, and I'm switching all of my rental properties to the 10-year units because it's such a hassle to go into a occupied unit. And what I've run into time and time again, you walk into a rental unit, and Rodney just did it with his hand, is they just pop the door loose and leave the battery hanging out so that the darn thing will stop beeping at them. And I actually tell my tenants, if the smoke alarm needs a battery, to please put a battery in it, and we'll give them rent credit for it, just to try and encourage them not to do it. But boy, I've been doing this a long time. I would say I've seen at least 10 smoke alarms hanging open, and it's almost always the one in the kitchen, probably one of the most dangerous spots not to have a smoke alarm. And most of them require smoke alarms in the bedroom hallway. If you've got a split master, as we do in some of our nicer suburban houses, the master's here and the other bedrooms are here, then you need to make sure you've got smoke alarm in the kitchen, the master bedroom, and the corridor serving the small bedrooms.
I put in a note in regarding to damaged smoke detectors that I will charge them a fine.
Yeah.
For anything damaging, if they don't replace the battery or if I find it's missing. I've seen them completely missing. Now, I'll charge them a fee.
Yeah, they pull them down.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in the end, if somebody leaves and you've got the deposit, and bottom line is your capacity to collect becomes questionable, right?
Yeah, and on that, from a legal standpoint, I'm going to wrap up with that because it's 1:30. From a legal standpoint, is make sure if you take 5 cents out of a security deposit that you provided a letter to the tenant within 30 days. This is pretty universal across the United States, by the way. So there may be some local rules, but the general rule is across most of the United States is within 30 days you need to give them their security deposit back, or you need to give them a letter detailing every deduction you've made. And yes, folks, I have had several former tenants go postal on me because they thought we were unfair, and I said, here's the receipt for the cleaning service, here's the replacement of the smoke alarm that was missing, we just painted this whole area, we brought in a specialist to do odor control because your cat painted a room, and we provide the list, but we're real careful with that. On my tenants who don't have a deduction, I usually give the money back to them in 5 days. Because I want to have a good reputation as a landlord. So when we make a big issue, and we tell people up front, we say, our objective is to give you all of your security deposit back.
Both of our objectives.
Absolutely. They want it back. We'd like to give it to them and not have people mad at us.
But today, because we have the facility of photography.
Yeah.
Real quick, could you expound on your 60-day notice? That one really piqued my interest.
It's just you just in the leases where it used to say you have to give 30 days notice, you just change it to 60. It's the simplest change in the world. And what you're doing is you're pushing everything early. Now, as the landlord, you need to be on top of things because you need to decide 60 days out. You go to the tenant and you say, hey, your rent's $1,000 a month right now. It's going to be $1,050 starting on June 1. Are you planning to renew? I just want you to know what the new rent will be. The person says, well, if you're raising the rent, I'm going to move. Then you send them an email and say, this confirms our discussion. We had this. I am going to be immediately looking for a new tenant. And then you immediately post the property. We usually post the first week of the second month out, so that as soon as we know the tenant is not going to renew, we post the property right away and aggressively try and get it rented by the end of the first month out rather than getting into the second month.
You're just increasing your time to.
And like I said, my vacancy factor is down here. Now, and you're applying for a mortgage, some of the mortgage companies are using a 25% vacancy number to be very conservative. And that's a killer, by the way, but, I've been able to persuade some of the mortgage brokers I work with that do a lot of work on rental properties. They'll be more sophisticated. They'll actually look at your rent rolls and say, yeah, you've done a good job. We'll use 90% instead of 75%. So, being diligent and having good records is its own reward.
What is with respect to deposits, what would you say is the minimum loss on a repair or something like that before you go into proceedings on like filing small claims or taking it to that level?
Well, first of all, it's up to the individual owner. So for the rental management company, we do what they want us to do. I would say most of our owners, I don't think we've had anybody tell us to sue somebody for if they went past security deposit. We had somebody
not lawsuit, but definitely sending to collection.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so turn it over to an attorney that sends the attorney demand letter, and sometimes that shakes people up. But
there's a cost involved in
right. In my own case, I would
say a percentage above the deposit.
Absolutely.
It's worthwhile at that point.
I wrote off about $2,000 recently on property. So, and I know it sounds funny to say I'm an attorney and a broker and I wrote off $2,000. Some days it's just not worth it. and we did pretty well on the property. And what happens is when you do a change out on a longer term tenant, if you're smart, you're probably going to paint the whole house. The tenant is going to blow back at you, and you can say legitimately, look, you're in there 4 years, you had a dog, you had kids, the whole house needs to be repainted. You are never going to sell that in small claims court. So, we took about $2,000 loss, but I didn't feel like we were going to be successful arguing that, and I felt like when you sort out what might be considered normal wear and tear versus the damage to the property, it's just hard to sort out. So it's a judgment call, but I would say $1,000, certainly $800 to $1,000, it's worth having attorney demand letters sent out.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
So much,
yeah,
folks.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
The call as well here.